Hello everyone, viewers, comrades. My name is Joseph Ryan Banks, and today we're going to be talking about D'Angelo. You might have heard of him. He has a pretty big channel. Specifically, this is a sort of response to his uber clickbaity video titled Chappell Roan is speedrunning the end of her career right now, skull face emoji, where he offers some commentary on the Chappell Roan situation. I'm sure you've heard. I encourage you to go and watch D'Angelo's video yourself so as to better understand the points he makes and what I will be bringing up and making counterarguments to. This isn't some epic Twitter takedown. This is intended to be a response to what I consider to be faulty criticisms, some overall bad points, as well as tone policing that he does in his video. If you're taking the time out of your day to watch my videos, then let me first start off by saying thank you. It really means a lot to me that someone is enjoying my content and getting something out of it. Please consider subscribing to the channel, liking, leaving a comment on the video, and sharing it with your friends, as it really helps me out a great deal and gives me feedback on what I do here. Also, please consider making a one-time donation to my coffee. I will have a Patreon set up soon once I figure out exactly what I'm going to do with it, how best I can provide extra goodies to people who subscribe, and all that good stuff. If anyone has ideas or suggestions, please let me know in the comments what you'd like to see. Also, feel free to listen to this video as you're doing something else, like it's a sort of podcast or something like that. There will be some visual aids and graphs, but they aren't strictly necessary to understand what I'm talking about here. If you don't know who Chappell Roan is, or what the situation is, let me give you a short bit of backstory. Chappell Roan is a queer drag queen pop music artist who I was introduced to by my lovely wife Rachel some months back. She's been very vocal in the trans community, advocating for their rights, as well as women's rights in general, and we love her. She's a total queen and a fascinating artist and is really doing well in her career, and for good reason. Recently, she made a statement in an interview, which I'll provide and read for you here. Chappell Roan said, quote, "I have so many issues with our government in every way," she says. "There are so many things that I would change, so I don't feel pressured to endorse someone. There's problems on both sides. I encourage people to use your critical thinking skills, use your vote, vote small, vote for what's going on in your city." The change she wants to see in the US in this election year, she says instantly, is trans rights. They cannot have cis people making decisions for trans people, period. So first off, D'Angelo doesn't take issue with her advocating for trans rights, which is a good thing. That's great, we love that. However, he did have problems specifically with the phrasing of her saying that there are quote-unquote problems on both sides. D'Angelo says, "There's problems on both sides" is a talking point that is very popular among people who do not support leftist policies. What is he saying here? I think he believes he is referring to people who echo certain sentiments shared by Trump voters or enlightened centrists who are basically closeted fascists, in my opinion, or something in that ballpark. That is to say that it can be interpreted as batting for the Republicans, conservatives, something to subtly delegitimize the left. Either way, he's basically saying that it doesn't look good to even be using this phrasing at all in the first place, given who we know Chappell Roan to be up to this point. But really, another important point that I have to make here is that D'Angelo is operating with the tragically false assumption that the Democrats have anything to do with the left, or that the Democrats are even a left-wing party. If that's news to you, then boy howdy, there's a lot we need to go over here. The Democrats do not hold leftist values, that being values centered in the abolition of capitalism, centered on instead building a socialist economy built off of the rule of workers rather than the rule of the ultra-wealthy. The Democrats do not have leftist policies. They do not even represent the interests of the working class. They are a liberal bourgeois party in favor of neoliberalism, capitalism, and are staunchly anti-communist. I'm not going to go super in-depth on what neoliberalism is, but I will have a video discussing it soon in the near future, so just hang tight on that. What you do need to know for this video is that liberalism is what brought us out of the mode of production of feudalism into the modern world via capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, working class exploitation, and so on. Fascism is a hop and a skip away from liberalism. Leftist ideology is centered on a socialist worldview, a socialist mode of production in its most basic conception. This means that the working class has control over the state, the economy, and does away with the practices of private property, wage labor, and super exploitation of workers in other countries, which is understood to be a form of imperialism. If you want to learn more about this, then I highly recommend you read Imperialism, The Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin, or Divided World, Divided Class by Zach Cope, which gives a very modern take on the system of first world to third world exploitation and how it affects us today. Leftists do not support capitalism. The bourgeoisie or super rich landowners or liberal bourgeois parties, especially ones that take massive funding and donations from wealthy people or groups, foreign governments, and corporations, which is to say primarily the Democrats and Republicans. What leftist policy do the Democrats have? None. Zero. They are a right-wing party masquerading as a left option in the mainstream of US politics. Trump has called Kamala Harris a communist or a Marxist, despite them both sharing the same class interests and taking absurd amounts of money from the same donors. In reality, the Overton window has moved so far right in the US that any centrist position automatically sits on the pro-capitalist, pro-liberal, pro-free market, pro-private property, pro-billionaire class camp on the political spectrum. Chappell Roan seems to be aware of this fact and criticizes the current Biden-Harris regime and the overall lackluster options presented to us by the political landscape of US electoralism. She is also critically pro-Palestine. This fact alone puts her at odds with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and the Democratic Party, as both candidates have sought to prove how pro-Israel they are than the other. Harris and Biden are currently responsible for the ongoing genocide of the Palestinians at the hands of the occupational settler colonial terrorist state of Israel. Billions of dollars worth of weapons and arms shipments have gone to Israel for decades at this point. D'Angelo also makes the argument that Chappell needs a better PR team, that the reason she is so heavily misunderstood is due to her own failure to express her positions in a clear and non-vague way. To me, this is sort of victim blaming. When she expresses her honest, authentic opinion and people wrongfully become upset by it, that is somehow on her, not the people deciding to interpret what she says in a negative way or to brazenly put her in the pro-Trump crowd. This misunderstanding does not stem from a lack of ability to communicate. She communicated her points very well and very clearly. It is more so to do with the lack of political and media literacy amongst the general population of liberal and conservative persons, who also, similar to D'Angelo, have a lack of understanding of actual US politics. He has a liberal, that is to say, pro-capitalist, liberal democracy sort of take on this, and that it's better to vote for someone, that being Kamala Harris, even if she is perpetrating an actual for-real genocide, because at least she's not Trump, right? This sort of team sports approach to politics in the US is in large part due to the utter destruction of true leftist groups and leftist representation in mainstream politics, and revisionism. There is no position that is pro-Palestine amongst the mainstream media. It just does not exist. Aside from a sizable portion of actual citizens who do not support the ongoing genocide and have so far not seen any reason to go against their principles and go ahead and vote for someone arming and abetting these crimes against humanity, there are slim to none actual public figures who are against the genocide and are also calling out the Dems for being basically fascists. Chappell Roan is one of these such public figures that made it clear that there are problems on both sides, referring to the fascistic actions and rhetoric of both the Democrats and Republicans, because in actual material reality, they are both right-wing parties. Liberals just can't seem to wrap their heads around this point. Thankfully, it seems that much of D'Angelo's own audience and commenters make these same points. Here are some of the comments they've left on the video. Quote, I get the whole thing about both sides bad and needing media training. I just think actions speak way louder, and Chappell Roan has been really clear about her actions, what her beliefs are, with 2.2K likes at the time of screenshot. Quote, I'm sick of people accusing her of queer baiting. She's literally a lesbian. I swear to God, y'all hate lesbians so much no matter what we do, we're villainized for it, with 2K likes at time of screenshot. Quote, most Democrats are not leftist, but most leftists are Democrats because of the two-party system. The both sides argument has merit because both the Republicans and Democrats protect capital interests, but seeing it as a left/right divide is inaccurate when you understand the difference between liberalism and leftism, and see that both parties are liberal, parentheses, neoliberal, at their core. However, there is one party that is distinctly adopting fascism, and it's obviously Republicans, with 1.5K likes at time of screenshot. This comment, I think, in particular gets it around at 90% correct, touching on the fact that both the Democrats and Republicans represent capital interests and not the interests of the working class by any stretch of the imagination. They say that one is distinctly adopting fascism, and that's the Republicans. I, on the other hand, would go further and say the Democrats are fascist as well. They're just nice about it. More on that later. Quote, I don't know why people were so shocked when someone as pro-Palestine as Chappell isn't gonna fawn over Kamala, like, let's have some critical thinking skills, with 1.k likes at time of screenshot. I really like this one. Kind of puts D'Angelo's criticism of people not using their critical thinking skills to use on its head. This next one is a real doozy. I think that the criticism of Chappell for this is ridiculous. You keep saying that she should be aware that people don't use critical thinking, but the same happened to you not that long ago when you were criticized for not mentioning Gaza on your Starbucks video. People are always going to find something to complain about. You can't control it, and I think justifying or giving any thought to those opinions is a waste of time. Her message was clear. Yes, she was angry in her videos, but who wouldn't be? Also, the fact that a lot of criticism was fueled by Zionists who don't like that she cares about Palestine is telling. I find her not hiring a PR person so refreshing. Every time she comes out with a statement, I support her more and more. The only concern I have is for her mental health in all of this. Because dealing with everything she is facing must not be easy, but you should blame the people who are putting her through this, not her, and definitely not settle for, quote, communication is a job. You should just expect that response if you are not 100% clear every time you speak, even though people are just waiting to get you for anything at this point, unquote. Also, your take on the whole two sides have problems thing is just wrong. I understand the mindset, but the reality is that you can only push a candidate during the election period, not after. This is the moment to raise those questions and make them earn your vote. Just not being Trump is not enough. And she is going to vote for Kamala. It is not like she is abstaining, but she is pushing people to question her. I can't think of a universe where this is wrong. With 165 likes at time of screenshot. I really like how articulated this comment is and agree with about 99% of what they had to say, up until they say that it's fine to vote for Kamala as long as she advocates for people to question their candidate. I do think conditioning your vote and putting pressure on politicians is a good thing and actually encourages more meaningful and substantial participation than just blanket saying, go out and vote, which is kind of what D'Angelo says. I personally will not vote for Kamala, but I can understand someone making this point. And before someone calls it privileged for me to not vote for Kamala, I want you to know that it is not privileged to be against genocide. That should be the bare minimum. Back to my point about Democrats being nice about their fascism. They are social fascists, if you will. What is this term, you say? Well, it has historical roots. The term social fascism comes from the idea that fascism and social democracy, parentheses liberalism, are two sides of the same coin, in the sense that social fascism paves the road for fascism to make its way to power. J.V. Stalin writes in his work concerning the international situation, quote, firstly, it is not true that fascism is only the fighting organization of the bourgeoisie. Fascism, not only a military technical category, fascism is the bourgeoisie's fighting organization that relies on the active support of social democracy. Social democracy is objectively the moderate wing of fascism. There is no ground for assuming that the fighting organization of the bourgeoisie can achieve decisive successes in battles or in governing the country without the active support of social democracy. There is just as little ground for thinking that social democracy can achieve decisive success in battles or in governing the country without the active support of the fighting organization of the bourgeoisie. These organizations do not negate, but supplement each other. They are not antipodes, they are twins. Fascism is an informal political bloc of these two chief organizations, a bloc which arose in the circumstances of the post-war crisis of imperialism and which is intended for combating the proletarian revolution. The bourgeoisie cannot retain power without such a bloc. It would therefore be a mistake to think that pacifism signifies the liquidation of fascism. In the present situation, pacifism is the strengthening of fascism with its moderate, social democratic wing pushed into the forefront, unquote. This, of course, has its own historical context. It would be un-Marxist of me to throw this out the window and say that it perhaps has nothing to say on our current political situation. Social democracy is a liberal ideology. It is happy capitalism, where there are welfare programs, public works, and so on, but not limited to those things, obviously, while also maintaining corporate ownership of private property and commerce. Social democracy, happy capitalism, social fascism, liberalism, whatever you want to refer to it as, are ostensibly fascism light because they oppose communism/socialism, where the means of production are in the hands of the workers/workers state, in contrast to capitalism's means of productions in the hands of private ownership of capitalists, the bourgeoisie, the ultra-wealthy. The labor aristocracy is the mass base of social democracy. That is to say, labor aristocracy is the main force of fascism. Labor aristocracy is, in short, privileged workers in the first world who passively benefit from the imperialist exploitation of nations on the periphery, or the third world. The labor aristocracy has higher living standards, higher wages, and has made concessions to their bourgeois collaborators so as to stave off a proletarian revolution down the line. If you've seen my other videos, I briefly touch on the concept of labor aristocracy, such as my video where I take the Pew Research political typology quiz. That one is pretty funny, and you should go check it out when you're done watching this video, if you're so inclined. D'Angelo, like many US citizens, including Chappell Roan, even myself materially speaking, are part of this labor aristocracy, and it painfully shows with D'Angelo's extremely liberal/social democrat take on the whole Chappell Roan debacle. But this take is also a result of a lack of class consciousness on the part of D'Angelo. Most of his work is wrapped up in identity politics first and foremost. That isn't to say that what he does is generally bad by any means. I don't think that at all. But this video in particular is a gross example of the lack of political understanding that Democrats and Republicans are both right-wing parties, and some might say the Democrats are only a hair's breadth away from full-blown fascism. What I want to stress here is that you don't even have to have capital F fascist government to commit a genocide. We have a liberal democracy, quote unquote, and are currently consuming the flesh and blood of Palestinians for the sake of the greater military industrial complex in the United States. The US has a colonial puppet in the form of Israel. The late Hezbollah leader Nasrallah, peace be on his soul, even said as much. Quote, there is a misconception prevalent in the Arab world regarding Israel-US relations. We keep repeating this lie about the Zionist lobby, that the Jews rule America and are the real decision makers and so on. No, America itself is the decision maker. In America, you have the major corporations. You have a trinity of the oil companies, the weapons industry, and the so-called Christian Zionism. The decision-making is in the hands of this alliance. Israel used to be a tool at the hands of the British, and now it is a tool in the hands of America. Unquote. The argument can absolutely be made that we are living under a fascist regime currently, with how much the state represses dissenting voices, protests, how much police brutality there is against the general population, how we have enshrined slavery in the Constitution under the guise of prison labor, sending people to be normalized by imperialist warfare across the globe to be stationed at one of the 800 that we know of American military bases around the world to monitor the economies and polities of every subordinate nation outside the global north. I'd say it's pretty clear. Anyways, back to the D'Angelo video. I apologize for the fact that this essay is tending to go in a lot of various directions, but it all has a point, I promise you. He goes over some of the ways in which big social media accounts and inflammatory tabloids quoted her snippet of the interview and spun it way out of proportion, churning it out for content. One such post claiming that Roan was, quote, an embarrassment to lesbians, unquote, which is just gross and homophobic. D'Angelo says these things she said out of context sound really bad, which I disagree with. He says that the quote-unquote news and pop culture accounts that are clipping this out of context and spreading it all over the internet are definitely at fault here, in his opinion. Which I agree. There's smearing over Roan's words happening here. But then he also takes a duplicitous stance and says, quote, but at the same time, media training, a little bit of practice with interviews would have alleviated this issue because, I promise you, a good PR person would never have allowed Chappell to say this in that exact wording because a good PR person would want to avoid Time magazine articles like this, Chappell Roan's both sides and non-endorsement divides the internet, unquote. This is where he makes the claim that Chappell Roan is, quote, employing false balance, which is terminology in the media, unquote, where he proceeds to read off the Wikipedia definition, stating that it is, quote, both sidesism, a media bias in which journalists present an issue as being more balanced between opposing viewpoints than the evidence supports, unquote. Then he says, quote, why are we talking in circles about both sides when one side is objectively so much worse, unquote? Well, let's look at the facts. Republicans, specifically Trump's platform, is working towards sealing the border and stopping the migrant invasion, quote, to carry out the largest deportation operation in American history, unquote. Classic right-wing fear-mongering and racial fascist positions on migrants. Now, what has Biden's policy been on border control? In just 3 years, Biden and Kamala deported or repatriated, such an Orwellian term, more than double the amount of human beings Trump deported in 4 years. This data comes from the official OHSS Immigration Enforcement and Legal Processes table from April of this year, 2024. And Kamala's border policy is to come up with, quote, tough, smart solutions to secure the border, keep communities safe, and reform our broken immigration system, unquote. You can read the rest of her promises to strengthen border violence here. So both sides are pretty racist and anti-immigrant, all things considered. These stats are in no way meant to make Trump look good by any stretch of the imagination. My point is to illustrate the actual level of bipartisan cooperation between Republicans and Democrats, that there is not a substantial difference in their economic policies. Only in their stated positions on identity politics are there any sort of differences. Which is to say, Democrats are basically Republicans with a bigger smile. Republicans are just out and about fascists, while Democrats are more covert about their social fascism. Trump wants to, quote, stop outsourcing and turn the United States into a manufacturing superpower, unquote. This is most likely a blatant lie. Under the Trump regime, total construction spending on manufacturing facilities did not break even $100 million in spending. Biden and Harris poured a far more substantial amount of money into construction of manufacturing facilities in the U.S., which strengthens the buying off of domestic labor aristocrats. One of the most harrowing things Trump has on his campaign page and part of his platform is to, quote, deport pro-Hamas radicals and make our college campuses safe and patriotic again, unquote. So basically, anyone who protests the genocide of the Palestinians are going to be even further criminalized than they already have been under Biden. It's literally a contest between the two bourgeois parties about who can be more pro-Israel. This was made obvious to the general public through many statements given by Biden, as well as the back and forth between Trump and Harris in their presidential debate. D'Angelo couches his pseudo-left liberal analysis in having a communications degree and states that, quote, the burden of communication falls on the communicator. It's your job to make sure that you're not being misunderstood, unquote. He limply addresses criticisms to this point, saying that, quote, this is a myth and communication should be a two-way thing. The audience has a responsibility to be critical about what they're hearing and be open to it, but they're not. That's the thing. Audiences, they're not like this, unquote. Which is really interesting to me, perhaps considering the level of criticism D'Angelo gets for sort of hand-waving this counterpoint in his comment section. One comment in particular amongst hundreds that have pointed out the various holes in D'Angelo's logic and arguments really speaks to me and directly goes against the idea that the burden of communication falls on you, rather than it being two ways, or that some people will just choose to misinterpret things or twist words in ways to best suit their own narrative. The comments made goes something like this. Quote, I hope you see this and I love your content. I'm autistic. I communicate as straightforward as possible 99% of the time. It is not my job to make sure that saying exactly what I mean comes across to someone else as exactly what I mean. Neurotypical communication is bullshit, and so is the notion that it's on the speaker to be heard properly. If I say something fits and it gets misheard as it shits, you misheard it. I didn't say that. In a video that minorly touches on society being bullshit in a follow-up to another from someone who's talked about various issues with it before, this is a take you're wrong on. Just because this is how people see communication doesn't mean it should be. It's just another thing we should push to change how people think of. Is it the biggest issue? No, not even close. But damn it, this is not my responsibility to make sure someone else isn't an idiot, unquote. Another comment, short and sweet, which I absolutely agree with, quote, as a non-American, it's crazy to me that you call the Democratic Party the left, unquote. I think it should be fairly obvious at this point that there is in fact bad on both sides of the Democrats and Republicans, because they both represent these same fundamental capitalist interests, not the interests of the working class. There are problems on both sides because these sides are framed as opposing in D'Angelo's arguments, are in fact two sides of the same exact coin. The coin of fascism and capitalism. Speaking in an international context, Problems on the left versus right, we can take a look at Trotskyists as an example of bad, unproductive leftists. They reject the legitimacy of the USSR, or Maoist China, or pretty much any example of actually existing socialism elsewhere in the world. I mean, have you heard of leftist sectarianism? Trotskyists tend to be the most divisive and polarized divisions of left comms that you can find out in the wild. Here's a flowchart, for example, of various Trotskyist internationals. I am of the opinion that Trots are the example most often cited by centrists and rightists when referring to someone making the argument that, quote, communism has never really existed, unquote, or that, quote, socialism has never really existed, quote unquote. They believe themselves to be ultra-orthodox Marxists, very fundamental, and reject the idea of Vladimir Lenin, or Stalin, or Mao. They call themselves left communists, but in reality are simply just left anti-communists. They really give the whole concept of leftist infighting an entire dimension all their own. We know of the problems on the right: bigotry, chauvinism, racism, capitalist exploitation, etc. Patriarchy has an entire dimension that underpins class society, and the right is principally patriarchal in almost every facet of its policies. Not only that, but many like to create false equivalencies between fascists and communists via horseshoe theory or some such nonsense. Some who claim to be liberals fall into this sort of camp, where instead of ever supporting the communists, when fascism is presenting itself as a greater enemy, they lurch to the right and show themselves to be ultimately in service of capital and its endless divisive machinations. Hence the phrase, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. It often bears repeating. D'Angelo brings up Taylor Swift and her recent endorsement of Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party and finds no issue with it because he, quote, does not think Taylor Swift is genocidal or against marginalized communities. It's not even about Taylor trying to change the mind of Trump supporters. We just need people to vote, unquote. He then says that he was actually a lot more receptive to what Chappell Roan was saying than some people because he feels like the message was, quote, we just need to vote, use your vote, unquote, which to me doesn't register as particularly critical of the system itself, which is to say, not very leftist. In my opinion, and it's something of a Marxist-Leninist perspective, that the only reason we should participate in parliamentary electoral politics is to hasten its destruction, downfall, dissolution, to show the flaws in the system itself. Because liberal bourgeois electoralism only serves to benefit the labor aristocracy and their bourgeois allies. It is still couched in what is principally bourgeois politics. It is not Marxist, socialist, or even communist. Social democrats or social fascists are revisionist and believe that we can reform our way to a communist society, which is principally anti-Marxian. Marxist-Leninism is revolutionary in its foundation. The working class needs to become conscious of their class position, their class interests, how they are fundamentally opposed to the class interests of the bourgeoisie, how they are exploited, how the relationship of the capitalists and workers is of a contradictory dialectical character. It is clear to Marxist-Leninists that the bourgeois ruling class will not give up their power willingly. They will not peacefully hand over the reins of the state and economy to the proletariat, and so revolution is necessary. To be sure, it has not always gone the violent route, but it has the majority of the time, and that there have been revolutions, successful or otherwise. While I am in no way here advocating for celebrity worship or anything like that, Chappell Roan is representative of the actual differences between leftist queer people and liberal Democrats who only buy Pride merch during Pride Month, and then forget about participating in real solidarity with their queer brothers, sisters, and NB siblings. They are insulated from the struggles of marginalized groups, be it through whiteness, race, gender, socioeconomic status, etc. I appreciate where Chappell Roan stands. She is pro-Palestine. I appreciate the position that she has taken and has also basically asked to be left alone after this whole entire thing, after being bullied into giving a verbal endorsement to Kamala Harris after being smeared by every tabloid and social media quote-unquote news account. She is, in my opinion, obviously an artist first, an artist who has been made famous thanks to her talents as well as what is seen as her marketability by big music industry capitalists. The differences between the Democrat and Republican parties seems less and less glaring and polarized when viewed from the place where human beings in the third world or periphery are standing. From the perspectives of people whose countries that have had their workers' rights smashed, their leftist movements destroyed, their homes bombed, their lives ruined by foreign, read United States, capital, by imperialism. American electoral politics are simply a performance. They are theatrics. Because whether it's Biden, Trump, Kamala, Waltz, or J.D. Vance, there will still be a hand to sign over arms and bombs to be used against those who resist the operations of U.S. capital interests. Where the systems of capital and structures of white supremacy have in their hands the reins of the state and economic forces of the land, there will be those who seek to profit, exploit, enslave, and dominate domestic and third world markets, labor, and resources. As long as capitalism exists in the imperial core, there will be no true justice for the Palestinians. There will be no rest for the world's communist movements. And the children who are bombed in their schools, shelters, homes will know that there is in fact no difference at all which politician stands at the head of the US or NATO or its puppet states. Thank you for watching.